were the governors of a brutal, Neanderthal, shambling, hairy, vicious creature, which of these characters would be most likely for you to follow? Plato is saying, let's take life and remodel it. Aristotle says, let's know more of life, but meanwhile serve the king. Absolute monarchies. So this is where Aristotle was picked and chosen to act as kind of a template for some of the guides that became later Rome. Oh, incidentally, just for the heck of it, trivia game. Socrates and Plato, of course, were troublemakers and did get into trouble. I can't remember how Plato died, but I know that Socrates was killed by people forced him to drink poison. And that's how Socrates died. Dumb question number one. Which of these characters would be chosen by a vicious, aggressive plutocracy? Aristotle, yeah. By the time that we got around to 50 BC, and incidentally, it's very common, I mean it happens, it's got to happen, that anybody that is aggressive, warlike, or peaceful, I suppose, develops their own philosophies and perspectives to support why they do the way they do. By this time, there was quite a bit less emphasis on great histories than on new forces that were steadily gaining power. Now, another weird thing was happening here, which was... I always feel silly about saying this. You know this old saying that money is the root of all evil? Well, this is funny. I don't know, maybe it's sick. Starting to happen around there. I'd like to read you a quote. Now, before you collapse into giggles, when I start talking about this money as the root of all evil thing, I don't know, is this where it came from? I mean, who knows? I'd like to consider you to consider this quote. I made note of this. That the first actual coins that were minted, if you're a coin collector, you'd know this, came from Lydia. Not John Prine's Lydia, a location. And for all of this time, the world largely existed on trade and barter. Trade and barter so that if you're going to want some building materials for your house, you would trade pigs, chickens. I don't know if they had pigs. You would trade livestock, or you would trade that you needed to do something for your son's education, and what you would do is that you would go out and you would work for this fellow for a week, a month. It was a trade and barter system. There wasn't very much around for coinage, and trade and barter systems were used throughout this whole time. It wasn't a very effective system. It worked all right as long as you never really went very far from home. Not being, facetious, until 100 years ago, most people didn't go far from home. So it was all right. They used measures, cubits, for instance, like somebody's hand is going to be the measurement. And of course, my hand is going to be different than your hand, so there was always variation, there's problems like that. Trade and barter, all through this. Now, what Rome started to do is that they said, since Rome was getting into bigger and bigger and bigger areas, bigger than what I've got written there, I mean, Rome had made explorations all over the place by that time. They weren't actually there to occupy, but they were all over the place. As they ran into increasingly farther from home and different peoples with different things going on, it became a good idea to standardize money. Standardizing money. And this is the first time that the concept of standardizing cash ever came about. If you think about it, it was never possible before. Nobody had ever been that big. Nobody had ever been that big to standardize and enforce a system of coinage. Now, with that in mind, give a listen to this quote. H.G. Wells wrote a book called The Outline of History in 1920, and he's some of these fun Victorian guys that are kind of neat to read. Quote, "Another respect in which the Roman system was an anticipation of our own was that it was a cash and credit system. Money had been in the world only for a few centuries, but the use of it had been growing. Money was a good medium for trade, and in Republic Rome, the financier and the money began to play a part that's recognizably similar to the parts played today." Now, the first effect of money is a symbolic thing. It's not like you're going to trade your burro, for something else. You can trade something that's this big for work, for property, for anything. It's a symbolic wealth, but really different than what had been happening before. Now, the first thing that money can do is it gives a lot of freedom of movement. It gives a lot of freedom of movement to things that hadn't happened before. And that's the peculiar value of money. The peculiar value of money. Instead of a worker being paid in such a way that he's tied to his work, money leaves him free to do what he wants. He can eat his money, right? He can drink it. He can give it to a temple. He can spend it in learning. He can save it. Now, that was the freedom of money. But the freedom that money gave to the poor man, because in Rome by this time we were having huge differences of wealth and poverty. The money that was given to poor men was nothing compared to the freedom that it gave to the wealthy people. With money, rich men didn't have to be tied to the land. With money, rich men didn't have to be tied to houses. Rich men didn't have to be tied to flocks. Rich men didn't have to be tied to herds. Rich people could change their location. And they could move around with a freedom that was unheard of until now. Now, people began to buy land, which was a bizarre concept at that time. Brand new. They wouldn't buy a land to use it anymore, like people had always picked up, maybe they inherit their father's farm. I mean, this is nothing new. But people would buy land not to use it, but they would buy it so that they could sell it later for a profit. This had never happened before. This had never happened before. Now, I hope that you're starting to think about how the colonization of Rome has got so much to do with the way that we live today. This is the first time that it happened. Money floated the Romans off the firm ground. Everybody was getting a hold of money. Money was young in human experience, and it was wild. Nobody had money under control. It fluctuated greatly. It was now abundant. It was now scarce. Very wild concept. Really paving the way to modern times. Now, arguing about this, it took a while. So what we've got here is that from 30 to 14 AD, Augustus Caesar finally standardized it once and for all. And incidentally, trivia, if people were ever wondering about the assassination of one of the Caesars under the guy Brutus and all that sort of stuff, he was assassinated in 44 BC. Now, I want to show you a couple other quick maps here. By the time that money was standardized and Augustus Caesar comes in, Rome, of course, was continuing to roll. Ooh, wrong map. And Rome, by this time, had taken over any pieces that it never really had before. And so Rome made it all the way up to there, and then it was stopped by the Alps in the middle. This area was huge. This expanded. This became part of it. Rome took big chunks out of here that became absolutely Roman. Big chunks out of here and way into there. Massive. I'm not even going to start drawing the Allies, because the Allies were people on the fringes of occupied territory, right? So just massive, ridiculous. Now, I'm just going to put expansion. Now, the next kind of interesting thing about colonization is that it depends who you read. Some people say 313, some people say 337. What happened here, whatever it is that Christianity becomes the official faith. So, do you see how things began to take shape more and more and more and more? Latin as a language had been official for quite some time now. So we've got standardized books, we've got standardized language, and now we've got a standardized religion. And Rome continued to be brutal. I mean, when Mark Antony or whoever it was killed that Caesar, they were fighting over internal struggles. There was all these internal struggles over the management and the government of Rome. People had been fighting for a long time. People were saying that Rome should go back to its roots, and be, a real government by the people, for the people. But what was happening by this time? Some people say that ultimate power corrupts. Rome and the rulers, knowing how ridiculously wealthy they were and could be, continued to roll that way. And so the internal politics of Rome was what was smashing things up. As internal things were smashing up, expansion continued in the standardizing of things. And I'd like to read you a couple of pieces from there. One of the reasons for the fights is that people say that on 327 is when Emperor Constantine died. And Constantine didn't know what to make of Christianity. You should read about this in maybe History of Theology, the History of Christianity. You probably know that after Jesus was killed, that Christians had to go underground, and they were very persecuted. And to practice that faith at all, they had to practice in massive secrecy. And then over time, it began to get more and more accepted. Now, by the time 337 had come by, another 300 years, Constantine, who was as brutal as anybody else, and never really knew what to make of Christianity and this new faith, decided to get baptized on his deathbed. On his deathbed. Maybe he was playing the odds. I don't know. Constantine's baptized on his deathbed. That's why this is given as one date. This is given as another date when Christianity became the official. Whatever the disagreement, Constantine to us became very important because historians used to write, and they still write, about Constantine was second only to Jesus in the importance of spreading Christianity. Let's say that again, because that's a wicked statement. Constantine was second only to Jesus in the spread of Christianity. Now, in those days, under brutal Rome, it's not as if people would knock at your house and try to talk you into it. You did follow the faith, or you would suffer the consequences. So that's the way it operated at that time. Now, a couple other interesting things going on here. There was a very famous book written called The City of God. It was a book written by a fellow who later became a saint, St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was important because by the time St. Augustine came around, after this, and Christianity had been, gaining strength. In fact, let's illustrate that. Christianity had slowly been gaining. Had slowly been gaining for a while, and really started to pick up here. So by the time that this rolled around, St. Augustine, a high representative of the church, became intrinsically involved with the government of the people. And this is where they talk about this huge bedfellows of the church and the state. The next time you pick up the Sun and you see Alicia Corbella talking about the church and the state, now you'll know where that came from. That's where it started. It had been going on for some time in the Roman Empire, but it had always happened. If you think about it, just to go off on a tangent just for a second, something that I don't do. If you think about Egypt, let's pick on movies. You guys have seen The Mummy a few years ago? Good movie. Great special effects. For our purposes, it's interesting to think of that in the time of ancient Egypt, 4000 BC, way before this stuff, 4000 BC, there was the connection between the church and the state even then, because they thought that Pharaoh was God come to earth. Pharaoh was God in human form. So it's a fairly short leap to make these huge connections between church and state here. It had been going on for a long time. Now, St. Augustine in this book said some very interesting things. Number one, Rome was the theological and organized kingdom of heaven on earth. Now, that's a wild statement. Let's say it again. Rome was, no doubt about it, according to him, the theological and organized kingdom of heaven on earth. They saw Rome, and Rome was beautiful. Rome was beautiful. Again, go and look at pictures and accounts of early Rome. I mean, the beauty and the grandeur of Rome was ridiculous, the richness. They saw that Rome was so wonderful that it was heaven on earth. He also said a couple of other interesting things. With the cooperation of the state, that the church was going to be the ruler of the world over all nations. That's a big statement. Let's say it again. Under the emperors, under their bedfellows, the church was going to be the ruler of the world over all nations. The Pope, who lived in Rome, still lives in Rome, was the highest on earth to God. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff. And you can see the melding of church and state, where church doctrine became so tightly ingrained and interwoven with affairs of government, affairs of the state. Incidentally, I know that there's a First Nations large component here, and for some of the things, well, not for some of the things, for almost all of the things that happened